Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. This will be a little bit of a shaky cam video because I'm going to be dragging the camera around to show you something I need a specific angle on. All right, so let's get started. So what I wanted to talk about today, if you can't see it, obviously it's this crack right here at the end of the fretboard. This is indicative of some work that was done at some point. I'm not sure when, by who, or, whatever. I don't know the details. This guitar came to me like this, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it. This is a thing that can commonly happen with some kind of less than graceful ways of extracting these nuts. Now, I will say that this is not a stock Fender nut, and so it's possible that this happened when this was installed. But like I said, I can't be sure. Nuts are replaced all the time, and so this could have happened years ago, who knows. But when you're removing a nut from, say, something like a Gibson or a Martin, where there's not really such a deep nut slot relative to the nut as on a Fender. As you can see here, quite a bit of that nut is actually below the surface of the fretboard here. Again, this would be on a Gibson or a Martin or a guitar of that type where the nut really has no support in back. Basically what you would do is you would take a block like this and then you would give it a tap with a hammer. Nice, short, sharp shock, just like Pink Floyd says. And what will happen is that the nut will come loose because generally speaking, the glue that we use for gluing these in is super glue, and super glue doesn't stand up very well to shock. And so the nut gets removed, you shim it, you reinstall it, or you install a new one or whatever, but that's how you get the nut out. When you see someone try to use that method to attempt removal on a Fender nut, this is the kind of thing that can oftentimes result. Because what's happening is that while you are standing a pretty good chance of shocking the nut loose, there's all of this wood back here. And you have to keep in mind that wood is kind of like if you grabbed a bunch of straws like this, that's kind of the structure of wood. So, when you're talking about like with end grain like that, there's not a whole lot of structure keeping that in place. It's like if the nut was in maybe this way or, in some different orientation to the grain rather than just at the end grain like that, this may not be such a risk. But there's also another point here, which is like, why would you remove it that way? There's better and worse ways that I've seen to pull Fender nuts. The way that I have kind of adopted lately is that what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll take this little set of end nippers that I've ground flush here. They're kind of a little messy, but this is a thing that I'll usually use for pulling saddles. And since this is about 1/8 of an inch, it's not really a whole lot different from an acoustic saddle. And so what I'll do is I'll grab onto the nut and I'll kind of give it a little bit of a pull that way and a little bit of a pull that way, maybe shake it a little bit, and oftentimes it'll come loose. And if that doesn't get it loose, I'll try putting a thing at the end of the fret right here, and I'll try knocking it this way or this way. And in cases where that doesn't work, what I'll actually do in some cases and have some luck is I'll take a little micro chisel like this one here, and I'll kind of go right at the base of the nut, and I'll just kind of tap that in very gently with a hammer. And oftentimes that's kind of the nuclear option, but that will work more often than not in separating the nut from the fretboard. That's not my favorite option, but it is one that oftentimes works. And then the thermonuclear option, if something was really heavily glued, would be to take a soldering iron, an 80-watt soldering iron, and just touch it to the top of that nut and cook it. It stinks high heaven. It is awful. It smells like a dead animal. But if you can heat up that nut, you can kill the glue. Whatever glue they have in there is not going to survive an 80-watt soldering iron. So you can go in there and you can generally just pull it out. So, there's any number of ways that this can be done without causing this kind of damage. And even if this kind of damage is caused, there are better ways to repair it. Usually, you know, if you end up losing a little piece of the back end here, a better way to go about it might be to use some wood glue, which sets a little slower and allows you a chance to like really get it matched in there with the grain, and to, you know, clamp that down with a little bit of tape or a little bit of C-clamp and a caul on the back. And that'll usually work pretty well. Usually there's a little bit of a visible finish crack, but when I use the wood glue method, there's a lot less of a visible finish crack. And, you know, definitely not a glob of super glue like this. And even if a glob of super glue needs to be involved, that be sanded down flush with the finish, you know, and taken to a buffer and made to look really nice again. Because this is a very obvious repair that really stood out to me when I started working on the headstock of this guitar. Basically, I'm just going in and pulling out the tuners. I was doing some work on some other parts of this and just happened to see that. Stood out to me like a sore thumb. So those are kind of some methods of dealing with it. I would advise, rather than super glue in this area, maybe using lacquer, because it's softer and you can go in and you can smooth it level with the finish a little bit easier than super glue. Super glue is a lot quicker, but lacquer is a lot cleaner. That might be a good way to do it. And seeing as this is a pretty nice Fender Strat, I think that I might opt for taking the time to do that in this case. And again, some good ways to avoid having this damage in the first place is to not use that normal method of nut removal where we put that block up and we tap it. That's not how we would get a nut out of a Strat typically, or any kind of Fender guitar. Usually, you know, going in and kind of working it and then pulling it is a good way to go, or going in and you know, knocking it from the side, seeing if you can get some sideways movement in it is good. And again, you know, kind of going nuclear on it, you can slide this under. And, you know, when sliding this thing under, a lot of times you don't even really need to hit it with a hammer. You can just kind of slip this under and you'll see the nut kind of start to move. And then you just kind of drive this, you know, underneath and, you know, pull the nut free that way. And just do it nice and gentle and slow. And, you know, like I said, thermonuclear option is taking a soldering iron to the back of this thing and just pulling it out after the glue has been destroyed. There's never any real reason that you should end up with this kind of damage, unless, you know, and I have encountered this, which is why I was talking about methods of repairing this. Sometimes people will get a little glue happy. Nuts like this shouldn't really be held in with a whole lot of glue. These are already held down by string tension, and in fact on classical guitars it's usually traditional to not involve any glue at all there. So when I glue these in, typically what I'm doing is I'm taking just like the tip of a toothpick and dipping it in some super glue and putting 2 little dots on the bottom of the bottom of the nut, and then slipping it into the slot, making sure I got it in the right place, and then just stringing it up. And in fact, if you want to be super precise about it, instead of using super glue, which is the way that most people go, you can actually just take normal yellow wood glue and use that 2 little dots, just exactly the same amount, just on the tip of a toothpick, and 2 little dots there, and then slip it in. And the wood glue will allow you a little bit more open time to kind of shift that back and forth to get the sides perfectly even here. And so that's, you know, maybe another thing worth keeping in mind, but it should just be those 2 little dots. Now, if somebody goes really glue happy and they just splooge a bunch of glue all over the back and sides, those cases are usually the cases that call for the soldering iron. And even sometimes with the soldering iron, it's really hard to pull it out completely without, you know, chipping a little bit. But this level of damage here that goes all the way across, that really speaks to me of maybe an improper removal method, maybe taking a block and hammer to this thing and trying to tap it backwards, which really, like, when you look at this thing, you know, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it's got just as much material in front of it as it does behind it. And, you know, seeing as most of that material is underneath that fretboard, it doesn't stand to reason to me that hitting this in the front, you know, towards the back is going to result in anything short of all of these fibers being torn out, because that's, you know, if you're looking at this from like a, hey, how do you engineer this particular thing happening? Well, if I wanted to pop all those fibers out, that's exactly how I would do it, is, you know, put a block here and then pound on this hard thing that's behind all those fibers and push it out. So anyway, that's kind of my little talk about nut removal on Fender style guitars, and you know, what to do if you get tear out like that, and kind of what to look for in terms of you know, proper glue amounts and everything else. If you like this video and you found it entertaining, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's also a link down there to my Ko-Fi and my Patreon, and if you feel like kicking me a few bucks, it's sure helpful. In the description, you'll also see a link to my Reverb page where I sell some instruments, as well as a link to my website where you can find my pricing information and my contact information, as well as a page that I wrote on caring for stringed instruments, and a recent addition to my website, which is the all about frets. If you go to the price page on my website and click on any of those hyperlinks under fretwork, it'll take you to this big long page that I wrote everything you could possibly want to know about going fretless, compound radius, stainless steel, gold Evo, whatever you want. It's on that page. And if something isn't on that page, email me a question. Let me know that it's something that you're curious about but you didn't see. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for watching.